Okay, I have a confession to make. I used to be one of those Horimiya fans, you see. You know the type. Someone would say, I don't really like Horimiya. And suddenly, I transform into a full-time defensive attorney. Your Honor, my client is simply misunderstood. The pacing is intentional. You just don't appreciate subtle storytelling. I bet you haven't even read the manga. I was insufferable. And the worst part is, I genuinely believed every word. Back when I first watched Horimiya in secondary school, this was just my favorite romance anime. It was my anime. I bought the cardigan. I jacked his shit. I copied Miyamura's style. Even now, every time I draw, I accidentally steal something from Horimiya's art style. It's cute.
Oh my god.
The show had me in a chokehold. So naturally, 5 years later, I decided to rewatch it. Oh, fuck, you know. Why is everyone speedrunning their own relationship? Like, is that how it works? You know, like in episode 1, strangers. Episode 2, friends. Episode 3, in love. Episode 4, basically married at this point. Slow down. Hey, what about episode 7? 7? Yeah, they had sex in episode 7. And that's when I realized something that's genuinely surprised me. Horimiya didn't change. You know, I did. Because underneath all the nostalgia, all the beautiful animation, all the, cardigan propaganda, this anime had some pretty big problems. And somehow, I never noticed a single one. Nostalgia is a liar. You know what's dangerous about nostalgia? It doesn't let you remember something. It lets you remember how something made you feel. And those are two complete different things. I didn't remember Horimiya. I remembered being 16. I remembered coming home after school, throwing my bag on the floor and putting on another episode. I remember talking about it with friends, to which I terrorized them with. I remember recommending it to literally anyone who asked me for a romance anime. And somewhere along the line, those memories, they fused together. So in my head, Horimiya wasn't just, a good anime. It became the romance anime, the untouchable one. And that's the problem with revisiting something you loved as a teenager. You're not just judging the show anymore. You're challenging a version of yourself. Because when I pressed play again after all these years, I wasn't expecting to watch Horimiya, but instead to feel 16 again. And that's impossible. No anime can do that. No song, no game, and no film. You can revisit the story, but you can't revisit the person you once were when you first experienced it. That's why nostalgia is so powerful. It edits things. It smooths over the rough edges and cuts out the boring bits. It turns good memories into perfected memories, essentially. And Horimiya might be the biggest victim of that I've ever experienced, in all truth. Because I went into this rewatching it, expecting to find my favorite romance anime. Instead, I found an anime that I still loved, but for complete different reasons. The first few episodes started, the animation was still gorgeous. The soundtrack still made me smile. Miyamura was still instantly likable. I was sitting there thinking, what was I talking about? This is still amazing. Then the episodes kept going and I started to notice things I'd somehow ignored for years. Conversations ended before they really began. Characters would appear, then disappear for episodes at a time. Massive emotional moments happened. Then the show sprinted to the next scene before I even had time to process them. It felt like I was reading the bullet points of an incredible romance instead of actually experiencing one like other animes did. That's when it hit me. I hadn't changed my opinion on Horimiya because I'd become more critical. I changed my opinion because I finally watched the anime that was actually in front of me, instead of the one nostalgia had been replaying in my head for the last 5 years. And once you notice the cracks, it's impossible to unsee them, you know? Why Horimiya meant so much to me. So, before I start ripping into one of my favorite romance animes, key word here, one of my favorites, I need to explain why I love this so much in the first place. Because if you asked the 16-year-old me the greatest romance anime ever was, I would have answered Horimiya without even thinking. Back then, I wasn't analyzing writing, pacing, or character arcs. I wasn't counting plot holes or wondering if the adaptation skipped important chapters. I just knew one thing. This anime made me feel comfortable. It was one of those shows I'd throw after a rough day and immediately feel better. Not because it had some insane plot twists every episode, but because it felt warm, like hanging out with friends instead of watching fictional characters. And then there was Miyamura. I genuinely think he's one of the most relatable romance protagonists ever written. Not because he's secretly attractive, not because he's covered in tats and piercings, but because he's lonely. That kind of loneliness where you are surrounded by people every day yet somehow feel invisible. He's awkward. He overthinks everything. He assumes people don't want him around before they've even spoken to him. He spent so long convincing himself that nobody could ever like him, that he'd already accepted it as a fact. And I think that's something a lot of people recognize in themselves. Maybe not exactly, but it's enough. Especially if you've ever felt just existing in the background while everyone else seemed to be living their lives. What I love most about Miyamura isn't that he changes. It's how someone finally gives him the chance to stop hiding. At school, he's this quiet kid with messy hair who barely speaks. The second he gets home, the piercings come out, the tattoos come out, the hair drops, and his posture changes. It's like watching someone finally breathe after holding it in all day. That image stuck with me for years. That's how much this series gets into my head. It wasn't just an anime I watched. It easily became one of those stories that quietly follows you into adulthood. So when I decided to revisit it years later, I wasn't just rewatching an anime. I was revisiting a version of myself. And maybe that's why what happened next disappointed me so much. And then we get to the biggest problem with Horimiya. The anime feels like it's in a hurry. Like, genuinely. It's like the studio got a phone call halfway through the production saying, right, guys, you've got 12 episodes to adapt. Years worth of material. Good luck. Because the pacing is absolutely relentless. Characters meet, they become friends, they catch feelings, they confess, they start dating. All before you've ever had a chance to sit with who these people actually are. And that's what disappointed me the most. Not that they got together quickly. I actually don't mind romance animes that skip the whole will they, won't they formula. In fact, Horimiya gets points for that. Watching two people actually date instead of spending 24 episodes blushing from across the classroom is refreshing. The problem is, the relationship never gets room to breathe. Every emotional beat feels like it's immediately interrupted by the next one. There's barely any silence, any downtime. There's barely any space for moments to linger. It's just scene, credits. And eventually, it started feeling less like I was watching these characters live their lives and more like I was watching someone speedrun their relationship. Which brings me to the manga. Now, before the comment starts typing, read the manga. Season 2 fixed that. I mean, yes, you're right, to an extent. The anime adaptation of Season 1 made a consciousness decision to prioritize the main romantic storyline. To do that, it skipped a huge amount of the slice of life material that sat between the major story beats. Not because those chapters weren't important, but because they weren't seen as essential to reaching the ending. And on paper, that sounds reasonable. Except those quieter chapters are exactly what made Horimiya feel alive. Those were the moments where friendships grew naturally, where side characters became actual people instead of names you occasionally remembered, where jokes had time to land, where Hori and Miyamura simply existed together without every interaction needing to push the plot forward. The moments weren't filler. They were glue holding everything together, and without them, the emotional highs still happen, but they don't hit as hard because the foundation underneath them is thinner. Now, yes, Season 2, the missing pieces went back and adapted many of those skipped chapters, and honestly, I'm really glad it exists. Some of my favorite interactions in the entire series are there. But here's the thing, they don't really solve the problem. Because by the time Season 2 released, Season 1 had already became the Horimiya adaptation that millions of people watched. Years had passed. The first impression had already been made. Most casual viewers had already moved on. And even if you watch them back to back today, those missing chapters are no longer woven naturally into the story, and it gets confusing. They are being refortified into a narrative that had already sprinted past them. It's like baking a cake, forgetting the sugar, then sprinkling it on top after it's already come out of the oven. Sure, the sugar's there now, but it's not mixed into the batter. It doesn't change the structure. And that's exactly how Horimiya feels to me now. Not incomplete, just compressed. Like someone took an incredible romance and hit fast forward every 5 minutes. And honestly, that's probably why the rewatch hurts so much. Because underneath all that rushing, I could see glimpses of the masterpiece people talk about. I just wish the anime had slowed down long enough to let us experience it.